All right, welcome back to the channel. So Errol Spence Jr. tells TMZ that the fight he wants next after Danny Garcia is Canelo Alvarez. That would be the biggest fight in all of boxing, and crazy enough, it's actually easier to make than the Terence Crawford fight. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back. So TMZ reports that Errol Spence Jr. wants to fight Canelo Alvarez after the Danny Garcia fight. And I got to tell you, man, I think that is a more realistic fight than the fight against Terence Crawford. And quite honestly, it just demonstrates to me how the relationship with Bob Arum and Terence Crawford is really preventing a really great fight from being made, because when Errol Spence Jr. legitimately has a opportunity like Canelo Alvarez, almost nobody could say that Errol Spence Jr. should not do that. But let's talk about exactly why that is. First, Errol's got to get past Danny Garcia. I'll do another video about that, but I just was watching the workout from Danny Garcia and the workout from Errol Spence Jr., and just the eye test tells me that Danny Garcia is about to get mopped. And that's something Tim Bradley also talked about, but we'll get into that over the next, probably the next video or two. We're going to be doing more, obviously more content about the Errol Spence, Danny Garcia stuff as we get closer to that fight. But after he gets past Danny Garcia, the next step for Errol Spence Jr., right? Canelo, first of all, let's go through the things that we're going to talk about. Number one, Canelo Alvarez, it's definitely it's the biggest fight in boxing. Number two, it's easier to make than the Terence Crawford fight, which is the fight that most people want to see for Errol Spence Jr. And lastly, Errol Spence Jr. has like the perfect style to fight Canelo Alvarez, even though there is definitely a size difference. But let's walk through those three things, and I'm sure in the comment section you can tell me on each one of those points exactly where you think that I'm making an error. So point number one is that this is the biggest fight in boxing. And I don't think that there's even anything that is relatively close to it of active fighters. Canelo Alvarez, if you look at the fighters that are big pay-per-view stars or they can do pay-per-views in the United States, you have, and that's very important because the pay-per-views are bigger, and also where the gate, and that comes into play. So Canelo Alvarez is a legitimate pay-per-view star. He's doing 1 million pay-per-view buys, and then you have Errol Spence Jr., who's doing 400,000 or 500,000 pay-per-view buys by themselves. So when you look at the pay-per-views, you have to assume that if Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez can do 1 million, and Gennady Golovkin has never been a big pay-per-view star or close to it, not even really a big draw, and they can do decent numbers. They can do, not decent, that's more than decent, 1 million pay-per-views. Errol Spence Jr. can do that, is significantly bigger by himself than Gennady Golovkin was. And so you have the Mexican demographic, you have the Black American demographic coming together for a fight. That is an absolutely huge fight, just because of the fact that these are two independent of one another. These guys are pay-per-view stars. So when you bring them together, it's going to be a huge thing, and that's like not the case with like Canelo Alvarez versus Jamal Charlo. It's not the same thing as Canelo Alvarez versus Liam Smith or anybody else, right? He could go all the way up and fight Beterbiev. That's not as big a fight for Canelo as it is with Errol Spence. Same thing for Errol Spence. Errol Spence has a lot of really good fights he can make, but Canelo Alvarez is a bigger fight than the Manny Pacquiao fight, because right now Canelo Alvarez is going to do bigger numbers than Manny Pacquiao is, just because of where they are in their career. So even though Errol Spence Jr. and Manny Pacquiao would be a really big fight, it's not as big as the Canelo Alvarez fight. And it's same thing with the Terence Crawford. Even though that is I think that's a fight that we really want to see from Errol Spence Jr.'s point of view, even from a legacy point of view. it's a bigger fight for Canelo Alvarez, a bigger fight with Canelo Alvarez. So just all around, dude, that is just a bigger fight. And I suspect that if Canelo Alvarez fought Errol Spence Jr. on a pay-per-view and it took place in Dallas, Texas, right, at the AT&T Stadium, first of all, that would do huge numbers even in the middle of a pandemic as far as like the gate, because you could charge astronomical prices for that. The floor tickets for for Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia are like $1,500 a pop. What could you imagine how expensive those things are going to be for Canelo Alvarez and Errol Spence? It's just absolutely a gigantic fight. And I think that it could probably do somewhere around 2 million pay-per-views, because I think that you bring in Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford, I think, do 1 million pay-per-views. Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez, I think, could do 2 million pay-per-views. And I think it would be the first really big pay-per-view to take place that did not include Floyd Mayweather Jr. Really doesn't include Floyd Mayweather Jr., right? Because the next one is, the Manny Pacquiao and the Conor McGregor fight. So, dude, that could be one of the biggest pay-per-views since Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s last big pay-per-view, which was the Manny Pacquiao and the Conor McGregor fight. So that's one side of it. Obviously, this fight is also easier to make than the Terence Crawford fight, right? Because both Eddie Reynoso, who is a trainer for Canelo Alvarez, said he wants to fight. Errol Spence Jr. says that he wants to fight. Canelo Alvarez is now a free agent, so he doesn't have to worry about Oscar De La Hoya, right? So, but Terence Crawford is not a free agent, and he has to worry about Bob Arum. And now, if you listen to Bob Arum, it's been delegated to Todd DeBuff. But whatever, it's still Bob Arum. It's still Top Rank, and they're still going to take their cut. Canelo Alvarez doesn't have a promoter now. Errol Spence Jr. doesn't have a promoter. Boom. That's huge money, right? And easier to make than Bud Crawford fight, man, which is absolutely a shame that a fight of that magnitude for Errol Spence Jr. would be easier to make than a Terence Crawford fight. How does that work? That's like a fight between Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua being easier to make than a fight between Deontay Wilder and, I don't want to compare Terence Crawford to Dillian White, but really when you compare like the star power between AJ and Dillian White and Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez, that's pretty much what you get, right? So Canelo Alvarez, I'm sure that Deontay Wilder versus Dillian White, because the Deontay Wilder is going to do good numbers and all the crap that Dillian White talks. However, it's not going to be anything like the numbers that you would get with Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua. It's just not. And so the same scenario is with Errol Spence Jr. and Canelo Alvarez, right? That it's a bigger fight, but it's also much easier to make. Now, obviously, the last point of it is that I believe that Errol Spence Jr. has the perfect style for Canelo Alvarez. Perfect style. Because number one, they're around the same height. Their dimensions are not different, are not very far off. Like I haven't looked at the reach, but I know the height and the general frame are about the same. Canelo Alvarez might be a little bit more, Canelo Alvarez is a little more stocky, but all of the computerall stuff to the side, Canelo Alvarez has also been allowed for several years to be fighting in weight classes where he doesn't have to lose the weight, where he doesn't have to drain the weight, right? He doesn't have to come down because he's fighting at 168, 175, right? So that's easy for him to make the weight, and he's carrying a lot of weight in there. If they fight at 160 pounds, Canelo Alvarez is going to have to come down in weight, and Errol Spence Jr. is coming up. And Errol Spence Jr. is already a guy that is a big 147. He could be fighting at 154 for sure. Could have started his career at 154, but you get my point. But stylistically, the reason that I like Errol Spence is because of Errol Spence Jr.'s body attack and the fact that he has so much pressure. Canelo Alvarez does not necessarily have the best footwork, but he does have tremendous upper body movement. Errol Spence Jr.'s work rate and body attack can most definitely score points for him against Canelo Alvarez. And also, I think that he would bring another dynamic that Canelo Alvarez hasn't seen in a long time because he's fighting these bigger guys. And that is hand speed, right? One of the problems that he had with Floyd Mayweather Jr. was hand speed. He didn't have that. He hasn't had a hand speed problem with anybody since Floyd Mayweather Jr. probably. So, I mean, all in all, I really like the fight. I hope it gets made. And I don't think anybody could fault Errol Spence Jr. for taking that fight, man, because like I said, that's something that's going to do around that could do 2 million pay-per-views at $100 a pop. And Canelo Alvarez and he are probably going to do something where around 55, 45, something like that. Because I think Canelo Alvarez is fair in that regard. Errol would probably be fair in that regard. That's just a whole lot of money. And I would expect that to happen before the Terence Crawford fight. Anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know yours. And with that, I'm out. Peace.